Imagine, just for a second, that you are handed the keys to a state-of-the-art, high-performance Formula One race car.
Oh, that sounds like a pretty good day.
Right. I mean, it is an absolute marvel of engineering. You are sitting in the cockpit, looking at a steering wheel that looks more like a supercomputer.
Yeah, those things are incredibly complex.
Exactly. And you realize you need to adjust the brake bias and, the aerodynamic downforce for an upcoming corner. So you reach over, you open the digital manual, and you realize they've given you the schematics and operating protocols for a heavy-duty diesel tractor.
I mean, it's got an internal combustion engine, four wheels, and steering wheel, sure. The fundamental principles of locomotion are there.
Yeah, exactly.
You can probably turn the key, get it in gear, and drive it down the street without crashing immediately.
Right, you can drive it. You can even drive it reasonably fast on a straightaway. But if you try to fine-tune the suspension or optimize the gear ratios or push that machine to the absolute ragged edge of its performance capabilities using a tractor manual,
You are never going to get everything out of that car.
exactly. And worse, you might actually end up shearing a drive shaft or blowing the engine because you are actively fighting the car's inherent specialized design.
That's a phenomenal way to visualize the foundational problem we are tackling today. Because when we look at the historical landscape of human physiology and exercise metabolism and sports performance,
The scientific community has basically been handing female athletes the tractor manual for decades.
precisely. The baseline physiological assumptions like how we prescribe training load, how we calculate recovery timelines, how we determine optimal fueling strategies, they were almost entirely built around male physiology.
And that brings us to a very special, first-of-its-kind deep dive.
Yeah.
Welcome to the launch of She's Built Different, which is a new female-specific series from FitPA's Train Smarter program. We are incredibly excited to bring this to you.
It's been a long time coming.
It really has. Let's set the stage here because the mission of this entire series is just so critical. For decades, the overwhelming majority of sports science, the foundational studies from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that dictate how athletes run, lift, fuel, and recover today, was built almost exclusively on male subjects.
Yeah, and the rationale was often that the menstrual cycle introduced too many confounding variables into the data.
Right, which is just why.
It's a massive historical blind spot. Researchers wanted clean, linear data. Men, generally speaking, operate on a relatively stable 24-hour hormonal clock, primarily driven by testosterone and cortisol. It's highly predictable.
Like clockwork.
Exactly. Women, conversely, operate on a very dynamic, roughly 28-day hormonal rhythm. So instead of actually studying that rhythm to understand how it impacts performance, early researchers often just excluded women entirely to keep their statistical models simple.
Which is just, it's mind-boggling now.
Yeah.
And the result is that millions of women have essentially been training on what Dr. Stacy Sims famously highlighted as borrowed science.
Yes. Women are not just small men, yet the protocols have been inherently male-centric for so long.
Borrowed science. It perfectly encapsulates the reality. But let's be abundantly clear right at the top. This series is not a complaint. It is a correction. We are not here to lament the past. We are here to update the manual.
I love that. Let's update the manual.
Our mission for today's deep dive is titled The Foundation: Hormones, Energy, and the Menstrual Cycle. And to do this, we are looking at an incredible stack of cutting-edge research that is finally actually mapping out the nuances of the female athlete.
We really have some truly groundbreaking, rigorous sources today. We are pulling heavily from a 2025 systematic review and a really fascinating exploratory field study by Nagorna and colleagues, which looks specifically at elite female athletes.
Which is so rare, getting data on true elites.
It is. We also have a brilliant 2025 paper from the Journal of Physiology by Colenso Semple focusing on muscle protein synthesis, some comprehensive recent reviews in Frontiers by Wen, and a highly detailed 2026 study published in Scientific Reports by Nuring.
It's a serious stack of literature.
It is, and we'll also weave in some foundational insights from experts like Dr. Ivan Sandbach and Dr. Angelika Hirschberg, who have really spent their careers connecting the dots between endocrinology and sports science.
It is a dense, deeply technical stack, but that is exactly what we are here for. We're going to unpack the cellular biology and the field data. And this deep dive is for you, whether you are a competitive athlete yourself, a coach trying to optimize your team's programming, or just a training partner.
Yeah, female physiology is the lens we are looking through today. But the science of understanding human performance, adapting to physiological data, and questioning outdated paradigms, that applies to anyone who wants to stop guessing and start training smarter.
Absolutely. So let's jump straight in.
Hmm.
The biggest misconception we need to dismantle right out of the gate is this deeply ingrained idea that the menstrual cycle is somehow a liability to athletic training.
It's the perfect place to start. For a long time, the prevailing narrative, even among some elite coaches and medical professionals, honestly, was that the hormonal fluctuations of the menstrual cycle were just an inconvenience to be managed.
Like a hurdle you just had to jump over every month.
Right. Or worse, they viewed it as a physiological defect that made female athletes inherently less reliable or robust than their male counterparts.
Which is just so damaging.
It is, but the modern research fundamentally rejects that premise. Estrogen and progesterone are not just reproductive hormones. If you take nothing else away from today, understand this. They are highly active, systemic performance variables.
Systemic performance variables, I really want that to sink in. They're chemical messengers telling the body to operate in specific, highly adapted ways.
Exactly.
To understand this, let's break down what those variables actually look like across a typical humanuraic cycle, which just means a natural, healthy menstrual cycle without the presence of synthetic hormones from contraceptives.
Right, because the contraceptives change the whole landscape.
Exactly. So we can divide the natural cycle into four main phases. Phase one is the early follicular phase. This begins on day one of menstruation, and at this point, both estrogen and progesterone are essentially at their lowest basal levels.
Correct. The hormonal slate is basically wiped clean. Your body is operating in a very low hormone environment, which interestingly is the closest a female athlete's hormonal profile gets to a male's.
Huh, that makes sense.
Yeah. Then we move into phase two, the late follicular or ovulatory phase. This is the crucial lead up to ovulation, and it's characterized by a massive sharp spike in estrogen. The pituitary gland is sending signals, follicles are maturing, and estrogen just floods the system, while progesterone stays quite low.
Okay, so a huge estrogen wave. Then following ovulation, we enter phase three, the early to mid-luteal phase. Here, estrogen dips from its massive peak but stays somewhat elevated, while progesterone rises significantly and really takes center stage.
Right, progesterone enters the chat.
And finally, we hit phase four, the late luteal or premenstrual phase, where both of those hormones drop off quite steeply, leading us right back to day one of phase one.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, what is absolutely fascinating is why those specific hormonal fluctuations matter structurally to a person's physiology. These hormones don't just stay in the reproductive organs.
Right, they go everywhere.
Everywhere. They have receptor sites all over the body, in the brain, in the muscle tissue, in the skeletal system, and in the cardiovascular system.
Yeah.
Let's look at estrogen first. Estrogen has a profound impact on how your body metabolizes fuel.
How so?
Well, it actually spares glycogen, which is the stored carbohydrate in your muscles, making your body lean more toward burning free fatty acids for energy.
Oh, wow. So it literally changes your engine's preferred fuel source.
Yes. Furthermore, estrogen increases neural excitability. It literally lowers the threshold for action potentials in your nervous system, making your brain-to-muscle connections fire faster and more easily.
Which sounds incredible if you're trying to fire on all cylinders for a heavy one-rep max or, an explosive sprint.
Yeah.
You have a nervous system that is just primed to recruit motor units rapidly.
Exactly. But then we have the second half of the cycle where progesterone comes in during that luteal phase.
Right. And progesterone has almost the opposite effect in several key systems, doesn't it?
It really does. It is more of a sedative hormone structurally. It can actually increase your resting core body temperature by about 0.5 degrees Celsius.
That is not insignificant.
No, not at all. It also shifts your ventilation rates. Progesterone acts directly on the respiratory center in the brain, often increasing your baseline respiration rate, meaning you breathe a little heavier or faster at a given submaximal exercise intensity.
I always like to frame this using a weather system analogy, because you can't fight the weather. If you wake up and it's pouring rain with gale force winds, you don't go outside and yell at the sky to stop raining.
Right, that wouldn't accomplish much.
No. You just put on a high-quality raincoat. Or you adjust your plan and decide to execute a highly targeted indoor workout instead. You plan around the environment.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. So if your internal weather system is shifting, if progesterone is increasing your core temperature and altering your breathing rate, it fundamentally changes the internal environment you were training in. So that week, your zone 2 easy run feels weirdly hard and your heart rate is drifting upward.
That's likely your luteal phase at work. It's not a sudden loss of cardiovascular fitness.
That is a vital distinction for athletes to internalize. It's not a loss of fitness. It's a change in the internal physiological climate. The effort required to hit a specific pace goes up because your body is simultaneously dealing with thermoregulation, trying to cool a body that is already running half a degree hotter and altered metabolic demand. But let me challenge this slightly. Because if I'm an athlete, and estrogen is dropping in that late luteal phase, and progesterone is high, and my easy run feels objectively terrible, does that mean my body is failing to adapt to the training stimulus that week? Or is it just demanding a different approach to fuel and recovery?
It is entirely the latter. The body isn't failing to adapt. Its operational parameters have just shifted. Progesterone increases protein catabolism, the breakdown of proteins at rest. It also makes you slightly more insulin resistant.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so your body might literally be requiring a different nutritional strategy, like an increase in carbohydrate intake during the workout to overcome that insulin resistance, or slightly more recovery time to achieve the exact same muscular adaptation it achieved effortlessly 2 weeks prior.
So what does this mean for someone listening right now? If I'm coaching a collegiate runner and she's hitting that luteal phase where her core temp is elevated and her breathing feels labored at an uneasy pace, what am I practically looking for and what do we do?
What is happening biologically is that the rising progesterone is altering her perceived exertion and cardiovascular drift. As a coach or an athlete, you recognize this by tracking baseline difficulty on those easy aerobic days.
Right.
If a conversational pace suddenly leaves her breathless or her heart rate is, 10 beats higher than normal for that specific wattage or pace, you are likely seeing that luteal shift. The most evidence-based action here is to pivot the expectations. Instead of rigidly training by the stopwatch or the power meter, you train by effort or time.
So slow down to match the feeling.
Exactly. You adjust the pace down to match the intended physiological zone. What you absolutely want to avoid is forcing a high-intensity, maximal effort workout when the body's internal climate is actively resisting the stimulus. That only digs a deeper fatigue hole. The research suggests treating this sensation as valuable telemetry data about the internal environment, not as a defect in the athlete's work ethic.
Treat it as telemetry data, not a defect. I think that completely rewires how we look at training logs. But, knowing the weather is one thing. Understanding how it actively changes the stats on the scoreboard is another. If we are truly treating hormones as performance variables, we need to look at the hard, quantifiable data.
And this is where we have to look at the 2025 Nagorno Field study and the 2026 Nearing study, because they provide some of the most compelling, rigorously tracked numbers we've ever seen in female sports science.
Yeah, the Nagorno study is particularly important because it wasn't just done in a pristine, perfectly controlled laboratory.
No, not at all. It was a rigorous field study monitoring 25 elite Ukrainian female basketball players over 3 months during their off-season training camp.
Right. And studying athletes in the field is notoriously difficult, but it's where the rubber meets the road. They put these athletes through rigorous daily performance batteries like sprints, vertical jumps, agility drills, shooting accuracy. What exactly did they find when they overlaid those performance metrics with the athlete's validated cycle phases?
They found that performance genuinely and measurably fluctuates in highly trained individuals. During the post-menstrual and post-ovulatory phases, which corresponds generally to the late follicular phase where estrogen is rapidly rising to its peak, the athletes demonstrated a staggering 7.5% increase in sprint time performance.
Wait, 7.5%.
Yes, they were objectively faster. Furthermore, they showed a 5.1% improvement in running vertical jumps during that exact same high estrogen window.
A 7.5% increase in sprint speed at the elite level is astronomical. In a sport like basketball or track and field, races and games are won on fractions of a single percent. A 7.5% difference is the difference between making the Olympic final and not even qualifying.
It is massive, but conversely, the study also tracked the downswings. They recorded a 2.3% decrease in acceleration metrics during the premenstrual phase, which is the late luteal phase when both estrogen and progesterone crash right before menstruation begins.
I'm looking at this 7.5% speed increase during that postmenstrual window, and I have to bring some skepticism to the table here. How much of that explosive speed is genuinely the physiological result of rising estrogen increasing neural excitability? And how much of it is just the psychological and physical relief of finishing menstruation?
That's a very fair point.
Like, did the researchers account for the sheer physical discomfort, the cramping, and the systemic inflammation that occurs during the early follicular phase, which might just be artificially depressing their baseline scores?
That is exactly the right question to ask, and it highlights the immense difficulty of field research. The researchers acknowledge this. While the estrogen surge absolutely lowers the action potential threshold, which physiologically primes the neuromuscular system for speed, we cannot untangle that completely from the alleviation of dysmenorrhea or menstrual cramping, which affects a huge percentage of female athletes.
Right, because if you're not in pain anymore, you're going to run faster.
Exactly. The psychological relief of being pain-free undoubtedly contributes to maximal intent during a sprint test. However, the 2026 Naring study helps isolate the physiological side of this equation by looking specifically at different types of strength.
Right, Naring's study looked at dynamic strength versus isometric strength. They analyzed 18 female athletes across 6 hormonally validated phases.
Exactly. Naring found that dynamic strength, which they measured using the half squat, peaked heavily in that late follicular phase right alongside the estrogen peak, and then it plummeted in the late luteal phase.
But here is where the data gets incredibly nuanced. Because while dynamic strength like the half squat plummeted in the late luteal phase, I read in that very same Naring paper that isometric strength, specifically hand grip strength, measured with a dynamometer, actually peaked in the late luteal phase.
Yes.
If hormones are just a blanket on-off switch for performance, that feels totally contradictory.
It seems contradictory until you unpack the different biomechanical and neural demands of those specific movements. Dynamic strength, like an explosive half squat, requires incredibly complex neuromuscular coordination. You need rapid firing of motor units, sequential muscle recruitment, and joint mobility.
And estrogen helps with that.
Exactly. Estrogen, as we discussed, enhances neural excitability, which directly facilitates that dynamic, explosive, coordinated movement.
Whereas isometric strength is a completely different mechanism.
Precisely. Isometric strength, like gripping a dynamometer and hard as you can without moving a joint, relies on absolute sustained muscle tension. It does not require rapid sequential firing. It requires sheer cross-bridge cycling endurance in the muscle fibers. The body doesn't just globally shut down in week 4 of the cycle. It just changes what type of force production is optimal.
That is fascinating. But practically speaking, if I'm programming for a hybrid athlete, and I know her speed and dynamic squat might peak in week 2, but her raw grip strength and isometric holding power peaks in week 4, how on earth does a coach write a structured 4-week training block with moving targets like that? It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It is complex, and this is why the researchers emphasize a massive caveat. Individual variability is remarkably high. The trends are real, but the magnitude of those variations differs wildly from person to person. And we must remember that these studies, including Nagorna and Naring, explicitly excluded women on hormonal contraceptives.
Because hormonal contraceptives like the pill, the patch, or hormonal IUDs downregulate the body's natural endogenous hormone production, they suppress those natural peaks and valleys, providing a steady synthetic dose instead. So this data reflects natural eumenorrheic cycles.
Exactly. If we connect this to the broader landscape of coaching, it explains perfectly why generic one-size-fits-all programming often fails female athletes. You cannot write a static 12-week linear progression and expect a female athlete to hit her dynamic power targets every single week without fail.
So what does this mean for someone listening right now? If a female athlete is looking at her own training log today, how does she take this data on dynamic versus isometric strength and actually apply it?
What is happening on a cellular level is that phase-specific hormone levels are subtly shifting her neuromuscular efficiency, altering whether she is primed for explosive power or sustained tension. An athlete recognizes this by analyzing her own data over a few months, noticing if her heavy dynamic Olympic lifts always feel sharp and snappy mid-month, or if her isometric holds, like heavy farmer's carries or rock climbing lockoffs, feel incredibly solid late in the month.
So the action step is experimentation.
Yes. The actionable step here is to use the research as a baseline to experiment. If she has flexibility in her programming, she might plan her absolute 1-rep max attempts or heavy plyometric speed work during her high estrogen phases. Conversely, she might program her heavy isometric work or steady-state grinding efforts later in the cycle.
What should she avoid?
What she must absolutely avoid is using the cycle as a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. We see this often. An athlete looks at her calendar, sees she is in the luteal phase, and mentally checks out or skips a sprint workout because she assumes she'll be slow. The research suggests using this data to adapt the expectation and the type of load, not to quit the session.
Adapt, don't quit. I think that is a powerful paradigm shift. Now, biology is rarely a one-way street. If estrogen gives us this incredible 7.5% boost in sprint speed and makes our nervous system fire with such explosive speed around ovulation, nature usually demands a trade-off. There's a structural cost to that hyperexcitability, and it brings us to a specific window of injury risk that most women honestly don't know anything about.
And this is where the scientific conversation transitions from purely performance optimization to critical athlete safety and longevity. The Nagorna 2025 paper, along with the extensive associated reviews in Frontiers by Wen, points to a very specific statistically significant vulnerability. Anterior cruciate ligament, or ACL, injury risk rises dramatically during the short ovulatory window.
The ACL is the major stabilizing ligament deep inside the knee joint, and ACL tears are devastating. They require major surgery and 9 to 12 months of grueling rehab. They are an absolute epidemic in female sports, especially in field and court sports that require deceleration and cutting, like soccer, basketball, and lacrosse. Women are statistically several times more likely to tear their ACLs than men. Why is this catastrophic failure happening precisely at the moment in the cycle when we are supposedly at our fastest and can jump our highest?
To understand that, we have to look down at the cellular biology of our connective tissue. Dr. Angelica Hirschberg's foundational work in this field has illuminated how sex steroids directly impact muscle and tendon properties. We mentioned earlier that estrogen receptors are ubiquitous. Well, there are estrogen receptors located directly on the fibroblasts inside your ligaments.
Fibroblasts being the cells responsible for synthesizing collagen and maintaining the structural framework of our connective tissues.
Exactly. When estrogen surges to its absolute peak right before ovulation, it binds to those receptors. This interaction actively alters collagen metabolism. Specifically, high levels of estrogen have been shown to decrease fibroblast proliferation and inhibit collagen synthesis. It actually changes the cross-linking of the collagen fibers, the structural matrix that gives the ligament its tensile strength.
Wow.
This practically translates to a measurable increase in joint laxity. The ligaments literally become physically looser and less stiff.
Think of this estrogen peak like a suspension system software update in a high-performance car. The update softens the dampeners for a smoother, more fluid ride. That increased flexibility is fantastic for generating dynamic, explosive power and moving through a full range of motion. But if you are on a soccer pitch running at absolute maximum speed and you aggressively plant your foot to cut direction.
If your dampeners are too soft, the chassis rolls too far.
Exactly. The knee joint translates past its stable limit, the ligament cannot handle the shear force, and it snaps.
That is a brilliant analogy because it captures the dual nature of the estrogen peak. You have peak neural excitability, allowing the athlete to generate maximum muscular force and speed, perfectly overlapping with peak joint laxity. The engine is producing maximum torque, but the suspension is at its softest. It is a biomechanical perfect storm for non-contact ligamentous injuries.
If the underlying cellular structure of my ligaments is actively being modified by estrogen to be less stiff, and I'm at statistically peak risk for an ACL tear during that 3 to 4 day ovulatory window, shouldn't I just sit on the couch?
Right.
Seriously, if I'm a professional athlete, why risk the season? Why not just stick to the stationary bike for those few days?
It's a completely rational instinct when you hear the statistics, but this raises a fundamental principle of tissue adaptation. Complete avoidance actually increases your long-term risk.
Why? Really?
Yeah. Tendons and ligaments rely on mechanical loading to maintain their structural integrity and stiffness. If you completely deload the tissue every time you ovulate, the tissue never experiences the stress required to adapt and strengthen. You end up detraining the very structures you were trying to protect.
So what does this mean for someone listening right now? If avoidance isn't the answer, how does an athlete navigate that ovulatory window without rolling the dice on her knee ligaments?
What is happening is transient joint laxity caused by peak estrogen-altering collagen cross-linking. An athlete recognizes this by tracking her cycle so she can predict when that brief ovulatory window is occurring. The actionable step here is to be incredibly intentional with mechanics during those days.
So form over everything.
Absolutely. The research suggests this is the time to focus heavily on extensive warm-ups, progressive loading, and flawless biomechanical alignment. If she is doing heavy squats, she ensures her tracking is perfect. If she's doing explosive plyometrics, she focuses entirely on the deceleration and landing mechanics rather than just the jump height.
And what should she avoid?
What she absolutely must avoid is skipping her neuromuscular preparation like glute activation drills, core bracing, and proprioceptive warm-ups during this window. The nervous system has to compensate for the ligamentous laxity by firing the surrounding musculature, like the hamstrings, to stabilize the knee joint. This requires mindful, highly focused movement. And of course, it is always worth discussing with a sports medicine doctor or physical therapist to develop a specific neuromuscular warm-up protocol, especially if the athlete has a history of joint issues or previous ligament tears.
Mindful movement and neuromuscular prep over complete avoidance. That gives athletes control back. Now, if our ligaments are physically changing and collagen metabolism is actively shifting based on these hormonal peaks and valleys, it begs a massive question that the fitness industry has been fighting over for a decade. Is our ability to build muscle changing too? Do we actually synthesize muscle differently depending on the week of the month?
This has arguably been the most hotly debated, fiercely contested topic in female sports nutrition and exercise science. And to answer it definitively, we have to look at the process of muscle protein synthesis, or MPS.
We don't need to rehash the absolute basics of muscle protein synthesis. Anyone who has spent time in a gym knows that you apply mechanical tension to the tissue, you create micro tears, and MPS is the biological machinery that repairs and builds that tissue back stronger using amino acids. But historically, the science on how female hormones interacted with MPS was incredibly confusing.
Confusing is an understatement. For a long time, the scientific community operated on a massive assumption. Because estrogen appeared to be anabolic, meaning growth promoting in certain reproductive tissues, and progesterone appeared to be catabolic or breakdown promoting in other systems, researchers extrapolated that MPS must fluctuate wildly across the menstrual cycle. They assumed you would build a ton of muscle in the follicular phase and struggle to build any in the luteal phase.
Which logically makes sense based on everything we've talked about regarding how powerful these hormones are.
It makes logical sense on the surface, but the foundation for that logic was deeply flawed. It was largely based on animal models, specifically decades of studies on ovary-ectomized rats.
Wait, rats?
Yes. Researchers would take female rats, surgically remove their ovaries to simulate menopause, and completely deplete their endogenous estrogen. Then they would introduce an exercise stimulus. Unsurprisingly, the rats struggled to repair muscle. When the researchers injected synthetic estrogen back into the rats, their muscle repair improved. But an ovary-ectomized rat in a cage is not a healthy, menstruating, free-living human athlete.
Obviously not. But that assumption, based on rodent data, birthed a multi-million-dollar supplement industry.
It absolutely did. But then comes this landmark 2025 paper by Colenso Semple, published in the Journal of Physiology. This study was brilliantly designed to finally answer the question in humans. They took 12 eumenorrheic women and tracked them meticulously. Over a 6-day period, the women underwent unilateral resistance training.
Right, so they trained one leg with heavy resistance and used the other, unexercised leg, as a control. Unilateral study designs are the gold standard for this kind of research because your own body acts as the control group. It completely removes the genetic and nutritional variables between different subjects.
Exactly. But the real genius of the Colenso Semple study was how they measured the muscle building. They didn't just take a single muscle biopsy snapshot in a lab, which only tells you what is happening in that exact second. They used stable isotope pricing, specifically deuterated water, or D2O.
So wait, they actually had these athletes drink heavy water?
Yeah, deuterated water, D2O.
That is wild.
It is. And the heavy hydrogen isotopes enter the bloodstream and basically tag the newly synthesized proteins as they are being built. This allowed the researchers, using incredibly precise mass spectrometry, to track the cumulative rate of muscle protein synthesis in free-living conditions over the entire 6 days.
Okay, that is incredibly precise.
Very. They tested the women over 6 days in the late follicular phase when estrogen is peaking, and then repeated the exact same protocol in the mid-luteal phase when progesterone is peaking.
Okay, the suspense is killing me. When they looked at the mass spectrometry data, what was the staggering result?
There is absolutely no difference in muscle protein synthesis or whole body muscle breakdown between the high estrogen phase and the high progesterone phase.
Wait, not at all.
Statistically, zero difference. The mechanical tension of the resistance exercise stimulus completely overrode the hormonal fluctuations. Resistance exercise stimulated muscle building equally in both phases.
That is incredible.
The researchers even looked at the metabolomics, the specific blood metabolite profiles. Despite the huge hormonal swings of the cycle, there were no dramatic phase-specific metabolic changes in how the muscle was repairing itself. Your muscles just want to recover and grow, regardless of what the calendar says or what phase you were in.
But hold on, I have to push back here, because this directly contradicts a massive sector of the fitness industry. My social media feed is absolutely flooded with cycle-syncing fitness influencers, nutritionists, and supplement companies telling me I need completely different protein powders for my luteal phase because my body is inherently catabolic. They're selling luteal-specific amino acid blends. Are you saying that entire ecosystem is entirely made up?
I am saying that the highest quality, most rigorous human evidence we currently have does not support it in the slightest. The marketing has vastly outpaced the science. The
Wow.
idea that you need a specific luteal phase protein powder to counteract progesterone is not grounded in what is actually happening at the muscular level in exercising females. The mechanical tension of lifting weights is the primary driver of muscle growth, and it is a powerful enough signal to completely override menstrual hormone fluctuations.
So what does this mean for someone listening right now? If an athlete is listening to this and currently agonizing over having the wrong macronutrients for week 3 of her cycle, what is the actual evidence-based approach she should take?
What is happening biologically is that muscle protein synthesis responds to mechanical load and protein availability, irrespective of whether estrogen or progesterone is dominant. An athlete recognizes this by trusting that her hard work in the gym is paying off equally all month long, even if her energy levels fluctuate.
So the action step is just keep eating protein.
Basically, yes. The actionable step here is to maintain a robust, consistent daily intake of high-quality protein. The most evidence-based approach is to consume between 1.4 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight every single day, distributed evenly across 4 to 5 meals to maximize the MPS refractory periods.
What should she avoid?
What she should absolutely avoid is falling for cycle-syncing supplement marketing that charges a premium for a physiological problem that doesn't exist. She should avoid erratic eating patterns or skipping her post-workout nutrition just because she is in a phase where she feels bloated or less hungry. The research unequivocally suggests that nutritional consistency is far more powerful than cycle-specific micromanaging.
Consistency over micromanaging. I think a lot of people just breathe a huge sigh of relief knowing they don't have to buy 4 different specialized tubs of protein powder. But this does leave us with a bit of a practical dilemma. If we can ignore the noise of supplement marketing, we still need to replace it with actual actionable data about our individual cycles. We established earlier that we should use our hormonal shifts as telemetry data. But how do we actually track this complex system if we aren't elite Ukrainian basketball players with access to a team of sports scientists drawing our blood every morning?
That is the harsh reality most female athletes and coaches face. They have incredibly poor access to accurate, real-time cycle information. It's a massive blind spot in programming. And the 2025 Nagorno study explicitly looked at this problem. They wanted to see if cheap, non-invasive tracking methods actually worked in a chaotic, real-world training environment.
What kind of cheap methods are we talking about? The standard stuff people do at home.
Exactly. Things like basal body temperature tracking, where you take your temperature with a highly sensitive thermometer the absolute second you wake up, hoping to catch that half-degree progesterone spike. Or the Fern test, which is an older method where an athlete looks at dried saliva or cervical mucus on a slide under a microscope.
Oh, right, where high estrogen causes the salt in the fluid to crystallize into a distinct fern-like pattern.
Yes, that's the one.
And what did the data show? Do these accessible at-home tests actually work for athletes undergoing heavy training loads?
Unfortunately, they found that these methods are highly susceptible to external lifestyle factors and often fail. Basal body temperature can be easily thrown off by a bad night's sleep, psychological stress, a slight head cold, or even just sleeping in a slightly warmer room.
Which happens to athletes all the time.
All the time. The Fern test showed very limited precision. When the researchers compared these cheap field methods to the absolute gold standard, which is drawing blood and using liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, or LC-MS-MS, to measure exact hormone concentrations, the cheap methods frequently fail to accurately identify the physiological phases for these professional athletes.
So the cheap tests are unreliable. And the clinical blood tests using mass spectrometry are way too expensive, invasive, and slow to do every single day. If both ends of the spectrum are unviable for the daily athlete, aren't we just flying blind?
We aren't flying blind if we change the instruments we are looking at. Because daily clinical monitoring is impossible for 99% of athletes, the athlete must become her own scientist. She has to look for secondary biological markers.
Like what?
This is where subjective data becomes incredibly powerful. The 2026 Nearing study proved this beautifully. Alongside strength testing, they used the POMS questionnaire, the profile of mood states. They tracked the athlete's psychological and emotional states alongside their physical performance.
And what did the POMS data reveal about the cycle?
They found that while an athlete's underlying motivation to train might stay perfectly stable across the entire month, their perceived fatigue and their mood disturbances shift dramatically. Specifically, fatigue and negative mood states peaked sharply in the late luteal phase, right as the hormones crash.
Meaning, how an athlete feels, her mood, her exhaustion level, her irritability, is actually a highly accurate objective reflection of her underlying physiological state. Subjective data, when tracked consistently, becomes objective evidence of a hormonal pattern.
Precisely. If an athlete writes down in her log that she feels completely exhausted, her joints ache, and her mood is incredibly low on day 24 of her cycle for 3 consecutive months, that is no longer just a random bad day. That is highly reliable physiological data.
That makes total sense.
And we have to remember, female athletes have distinct biomechanical and physiological advantages that we often ignore when we only compare the recovery to rigid male standards. For instance, studies show female athletes often have better closed eye balance, greater muscle endurance at submaximal loads, and a lower center of gravity. We need to stop judging female recovery by metrics designed for men and start listening to the signals the female body is uniquely sending.
So what does this mean for someone listening right now? If a woman listening to this wants to start gathering this data today, without buying expensive equipment, how does she actually build a reliable tracking system?
We want to empower the athlete to rely heavily on symptom and feeling tracking. What is happening biologically is the body is sending secondary signals about its systemic load and recovery capacity based on the hormonal climate. An athlete recognizes this by moving away from just tracking the weight she lifted and starting a daily holistic log.
So track the subjective stuff.
Yes. The actionable step is to track perceived effort, or RPE, energy levels upon waking, mood state, and sleep quality, alongside her training load for at least 2 to 3 consecutive cycles. This duration is necessary to separate random noise from actual hormonal patterns.
And what should she avoid doing?
What she must aggressively avoid is assuming that a string of bad training days is a permanent loss of fitness. She must avoid comparing her recovery timelines to male training partners who don't experience these fluctuations. And most importantly, she must avoid ignoring the consistent screaming signals her own body is sending her month after month.
I think tracking those internal signals is such an empowering first step. It validates what so many women have felt intuitively but were told to ignore. But we live in a modern era, and while a pen and paper journal is fantastic, it sometimes feels like we are leaving powerful tools on the table. We have technology that can look under the hood. So how does something like FitPA actually help with all of this?
FitPA helps you spot the invisible systemic stressors by continually tracking heart rate variability shifts, subtle sleep architecture disruptions, and elevated resting heart rates. By seamlessly correlating these continuous physiological signals with your logged cycle phases, you can anticipate changes in your recovery capacity and adjust your training load before you even step foot in the gym.
It's like having a real-time translator for the physiological signals your body is already broadcasting. That is
Incredible.
Okay, we have covered an immense, deeply technical amount of ground today. We completely reframed estrogen and progesterone from reproductive liabilities to highly active performance variables.
You really did.
We looked at the Nagorno and Nearing data showing how dynamic speed and jump height can peak near ovulation, while isometric grip strength might hold out later in the luteal phase. We discussed the cellular biology of collagen to understand the ACL injury risk window and how to protect the knee with mindful neuromuscular warm-ups rather than avoidance.
Yep, don't sit on the couch.
We busted the massive industry myth that muscle protein synthesis requires different protein routines across the month, proving that mechanical tension overrides the hormonal cycle. And we talk about how subjective mood and fatigue tracking can serve as objective data to find your unique patterns.
It is a profound, necessary shift in perspective.
Yeah.
And what is most exciting is that this is just the foundational layer. The more we study female athletes using proper methodologies, the more we realize how incredibly adaptive, resilient, and capable the female body is when we finally stop trying to force it into a rigid, male-centric paradigm.
Exactly. And I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on as you head out to your next workout or write your next training block. We started this deep dive talking about driving a state-of-the-art Formula One car using a tractor manual.
Right, the F1 car.
If female physiology is this beautifully dynamic, if your estrogen is quietly doing everything from remodeling the collagen, cross-linking in your ligaments, to altering the fuel sources your muscles use, and your progesterone is shifting your core temperature and breathing rates, how many of the universal training rules that we accept as absolute gospel today are actually just rigid male protocols that we've blindly adopted?
That is the central question that should challenge every coach, every sports scientist, and every athlete listening.
It is time to update the manual. It is time to stop fighting your physiology and start training with it. Thank you so much for joining us for this special deep dive. Don't forget to check out the cheat sheet for today's deep dive in the show notes. It has a great detailed breakdown of the 4 cycle phases, the protein intake guidelines we discussed, and the specific warm-up protocols to use during the ovulatory window. Train smarter, listen to your body, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.